I believe there are two main aspects that are responsible for that clean Ask look. It's hard to pick an illustration from Ask because there are some pieces that are very different from one another, so it's harder to find consistencies between them. But there is one piece. This illustration. After looking at this piece for a while, I've come up with two techniques that should emulate Ask's art style fairly well. Color temperature and line art. When it comes to the base color, you can pretty much just choose anything, because it's the reflected light that you should be focusing on. If you want cool shadows, start by using a warmer color than the base and then blocking the shadows in. After that, alpha lock or transparency lock the layer and go over the layer with a cooler color than the base this time, but make sure to leave a bit of the warm edge. If you want warm shadows, do the same thing but reverse the temperatures. Typically most illustrations will stack their shadows, and by that I mean they'll have a layer for the general shadow, another layer for shadows that are more detailed, and finally a layer for ambient occlusion. This gives the illustration a sense of depth and form because you're showing the light doesn't hit equally. Oriday has a good video on this, which I will link in the description. In Ask's case, the same principle is still there, but there's a heavier emphasis on reflected light doing the heavy lifting. When doing line art, use thicker lines for the outline and thinner lines for the inside. The colors of these lines should generally be darker than the surfaces surrounding it. When doing details, use a brush instead with a low contrasting color so that it doesn't stick out. When drawing lines, the most common thing to do is to have the thickest line as the outline, thinner lines on the inside to differentiate surfaces, and the thinnest lines for the details. This is done to organize the impression of the lines, because the thicker the line is, the greater the impression, and the thinner the line is, the softer the impression. And because the thicker lines are on the outline, your eyes are attracted to the silhouette of the character, and then your lines are attracted to the details. If it were the other way around, if your details had the thickest lines, then your eyes will automatically lock on to the details, which will make it harder to navigate.
Ask doesn't really follow this convention. There's not really a strict pattern. Instead, Ask's line art is a balance between value and line weight.
In line art, you would want a pen that has a vastly different value than the color it's surrounding to have a strong impression. Choosing a color that has a similar value to the surrounding color will decrease its impression, making them stand out less, which is what Ask does. This technique makes the details look like it's part of the render rather than the line art, making it more cohesive as it feels like there are fewer parts to the illustration. Since temperature and values are an integral part, I thought I'd quickly go over color theory, or more specifically how to precisely control them. To accurately control temperature. The upper semicircle consists of warm colors, while the lower semicircle consists of cool colors. What this means is that choosing a hue that is higher than the one that you currently have will give you a warmer color, whilst choosing a hue that is lower will give you a cooler color. To accurately control value, here's something I like to call a value map. Different colors have inherently different values, even if they have the same saturation and brightness. If you want to increase the value of blue, you should head in this direction. If you want to increase the value of yellow, you should shift to a band that is directly underneath. In other words, if you want to increase the value, go down the bands. Obviously, I can't talk about how to replicate a style without attempting to do so myself, so I've made a couple of attempts before, and as you can see, they're not so great. The third attempt is when it starts to truly take shape. The color choices are definitely better and more cohesive, but it still looks a little juvenile once you start to look at the details. The hair detailing looks a little unstructured, kinda like I just drew lines without thinking, which I did. Same goes for the wrinkles too. The basic structure of the render is there, but the intricacies aren't there. This would probably pass as an imitation if I zoomed out. Since I was starting to get the hang of it to the point where it looked good enough, I decided to record my fourth and final attempt because I thought it might be helpful to go through it rather than talk about it arbitrarily. To preface, my process goes sketch, draft, color, render, then line art. Basically, I'm telling you this beforehand because typically you do the line art first before any color, so I'm telling you this to avoid confusion. When it comes to rendering, first I like to do the simple shadows first, like the inside of the hair or the inside of the jacket. I then block in the shadows without paying too much attention to color yet, because this is mainly to get a feel for the form. I'm mainly concerned about the large general shadow, and then I'll work up to the deeper shadows later. After I feel the form the shadow is fine, I then change the temperature. Since the lighting is going to be a warm color, I'm also going to make the shadows a warm color. After that, I block in the reflected light so that it covers the shadows except for a bit off the top. Since the shadow is warm, I'm going to go with a cooler color for the reflected light to get that warm cool concept that we were talking about earlier. I use this warm cool shadow reflected light concept on every large surface, so hair, jacket, dress shirt, skirt, all of that. I also need to preface, or postface at this point, that I'm not using any special blending modes for the layers. They're all set to normal because I heard from somewhere that Ask doesn't use blending modes. I don't know if that's true, but just in case, because I wanted to get the authentic Ask experience, I also didn't use blending modes either. And honestly, that's kind of a pain at a certain point, because if you're doing something like details and you need to make them darker, then doing it single-handedly one at a time is kind of painful, rather than just setting it to multiply and then just painting it all in one go. Anyway, back to the process. After I get a chunk of the rendering done, I now begin to do the line art, choosing a color that has a darker value. This can either be a purely darker line, or a more saturated line, or both. I didn't talk about eyes in this video, but honestly, I think whatever eye style you have shouldn't matter too much. One thing I want to mention for the eyes is that for the eye whites, I've made the value close to that of the surrounding skin, which goes back to the color principle earlier in the video about reducing the impression. So that way, the eye whites don't stick out like a sore thumb. I tried detailing the hair with the same principle for any of the other big surfaces, like the jacket and dress shirt, except for the hair, there are more detailed lines, so it gives a sense of hair strands, rather than a amalgamous blob. To be honest, hair is kind of my weak point, especially on the left hand side, where it's just a blob of hair rather than anything distinguishable. At this point, I'm pretty much done with the bulk of the render, and all that's really left to do is the details. I forgot to mention this, but there's a technique I used for the skin that I think is worth talking about. This isn't necessarily specific to Ask herself, but I'm going to say it anyways. Once I have the base color for the skin with a gradient and line art and all that, I apply a bit of a darker color on the edges. This is a very easy way to add a bit of form because you're showing that the light doesn't hit the skin equally, and it's also a very quick technique to do as well. If you don't feel like rendering it normally by adding a bunch of colors of decreasing tones, try this out. I also tried adding in highlights in the hair, which was okay. Also, I forgot to record it, but I changed the color of the hair because the last color I chose had too much contrast in saturation and value, so I chose a brighter color and less saturated one. I also started replacing the liner with a darker color. If you know who this character is, then you would also know that I didn't follow the reference to a T. For example, the badge that she has and the pleated skirt. Honestly, I just got lazy, so my bad. But I hope that it's still enough to get the style across. Last but not least, I added in a background with the same warm, cool concept. Cool background first, gradient, duplicate it, move it up a bit, and change the color to a warmer color, and then add a noise layer on top of it. And that's it. Personally, I think this illustration bears just enough resemblance to her art style, especially when you zoom out far enough. I know I didn't say this in the introduction that I didn't make, but as you can see, Ask's skill in the artistic scene is unparalleled with her elegantly clean style. I use the word simple in this video many times, not to discredit her, but rather the opposite. It's astonishing. Because it's not actually simple, it just gives the illusion of simplicity. To be able to hide the complexity and intricacies of her artworks so effectively and make you think that it's so simple. There aren't a lot of artists that can make their art style appear so cohesive quite like this, and I think that really sets Ask's miles above the rest. This was a lot of fun, although it took way too long to do. If you have any other artists that you think I should do, then feel free to leave it in the comments. And if you feel like this helped you, then you're welcome. Okay, bye.